Great to be here. So we're going to talk about governance and quantum and AI and see what we can learn. So I guess I want to start, Kate, with you and talking a little bit about why are we talking about governance and quantum. When I think about maybe the last 10 years or so of conversations about governance and tech, I think there have been a couple big waves of governance conversations. Thinking back to sort of 2016 through 2020, we were all talking a lot about governing social media, and those conversations were a lot about democracy, they were a lot about misinformation, they were about political polarization, they were about free speech. And at least in the United States, politicians said a lot, they didn't do a ton, although there was some amount of self-regulation by industry of various sorts. In Europe, more was done. There was data privacy, data localization, and the like. We have now been talking a lot about governance of AI, where the concerns are maybe broader. All those social media concerns were repeated in the AI conversation, but we also talked about national security. We talk about the future of work, talk about economic competitiveness. And we've seen somewhat more active, we saw a big announcement yesterday, but we've seen somewhat more active government action, certainly with things like export controls. And I guess I'm interested to learn, sort of think about quantum. Not every technological innovation requires a governance conversation. If we had an idea for a great new tractor that was gonna, transform agriculture, we probably maybe wouldn't be having a governance conversation, we'd just go build it. What are the aspects of quantum that we should be thinking about that require a kind of governance and policy conversation? What are we worried about?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of, there's one very specific thing we're worried about, right? And that is the predictability of a large-scale quantum computer to break encryption. And so that is, at the end of the day, it's probably the genesis of a lot of the investment in this technology and also the reason it's being watched very closely for national security reasons. So many of these conversations we're having now around AI governance, there are echoes of those conversations around quantum computing. I should say, Google is building quantum computing. I'm speaking to that in particular versus other kinds of quantum technologies. And it's also, I would say, we can learn a lot from some of these other governance conversations. At the end of the day, a large-scale quantum computer, it's essentially a general purpose computing technology. It's expected. We've heard several conversations about its future applications. We have clear ideas of what some of those will be. We don't have clear ideas of the full scope of them, but we expect to be able to use these computers for many different things. And what kinds of governance structures do you have in those cases are the kinds of things we're thinking about with AI, with cloud computing. Who has access? How do you control what this computing platform is used for? These geopolitical competitiveness conversations, all of that is important for quantum computing. But we're also, I think some of the conversations that are ongoing now are very instructive for how we can think about this, and we're much further back than we are for AI, obviously.
One of the things I think that in both, certainly in social media, and I think to some extent in AI we're seeing too, that there were sort of externalities on society, political, economic, whatever. One of the other things that I think has sparked the conversation and made it sort of politically powerful at least, is there's a market power piece to it, that it looks like those are technologies that want a small number of big players in social media because there's kind of network effects on platforms, and in AI because there's just these huge fixed costs associated with training a model. Is quantum like that? Should we think of quantum as something that's going to consolidate into a few small dominant players?
Yeah, it certainly is a capital-intensive technology to develop, right? And so at the moment, it's mostly being developed by very well-funded startups and large companies, and that does mean that it is somewhat consolidated. I think one can have, and there are debates around this, right? Like with some of these governance questions we're considering, there's a side that's like, okay, we should open up access to this technology to as many groups and people as possible. But the other side of that is if you consider some of these potential applications, maybe you don't want to open that up. And how do you manage that tension as well? But whether or not, what exactly the market will look like, I think depends a lot on some of the technological innovation that's still to come. We don't know which of these qubit platforms will be most successful. There's difference in cost and scalability for the different platforms as well. So,
I'd just like to add, in one of yesterday's panels was saying because the way quantum is, it's very hard, very difficult, high barriers to entry, right? Like it has to be a cold place like Canada. It has to be, you have to have a lot of capital investment. You have to have a multidisciplinary team put together. So the barriers to entry are higher, but what the comments yesterday were that it's more about the governance and policies around it would have to be more about who controls it and for what purpose. Does that align?
yeah.
So maybe let's turn to a little data. So
I'd love to.
Yes. All right. So you got a survey in the field trying to learn what Americans thought about quantum and sort of what they thought about AI and thinking about them together. So maybe just start with a little bit of a summary of what do we know about quantum? What do we think?
Sure. Well, let me first start with, I work at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, where the logo on the troika up on the screen, that is not quantum nor tech oriented. We were founded in 1922, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization to educate and inform Americans and others who tune in about the importance of foreign policy. And in Chicago, we convene events. We have a podcast led by our new president, Leslie Vinja-Murray. And we also are known outside of Chicago for our public opinion polling, which we've been doing for 5 decades now. So it's a very reputable survey that a lot of academics have used in seminal works. And for this very conference, we conducted a survey just of Americans and their views of AI and quantum. So yesterday, I think it was the opening panel, Matt Forte, who was a former running back for the Bears, asked all of you questions that were similar to the questions that we asked. And one of the first questions was, of this crowd, how many of you are familiar with quantum technology? And the bulk of you were. And I'm here to tell you you're not really normal in a normal curve sense of the word. Of the American public, only 21% of Americans are even somewhat familiar with quantum. With AI, 2/3, 64% are familiar somewhat with AI. And I think that actually I was surprised by, because I think that's pretty high, given that, to me, the advent of AI kind of came for the everyday person when ChatGPT came online. That was only in 2022. So the fact that 64% are already familiar with that, at least somewhat, that shows you that Americans will learn and become familiar once these products are out in the open. Some other things we learned was that because there's such a lack of familiarity of these technologies, Americans are really kind of not that informed and not willing to give their opinion on a lot of questions about policy. So what I really focus on is those who do. One of the things that really comes out is that of those who express an opinion, they're more concerned about the risks that these new technologies will bring rather than the rewards. Again, a lot don't know, but it's about 40, it's a 5-3 margin, basically, that are more concerned about the risks. And I think in other questions we'll get more into that, but that is sort of where I'm coming from, that I'm trying as a public opinion researcher. I'm an advocate for everyday people's views. They want to be, they would probably like to partake in the benefits, and they're probably expected to take some of the risk as well. So, there in all the discussion about policy around these new technologies, there's indirect stakeholders and there's direct stakeholders. There's voluntary participants and involuntary participants, in the sense that they'll also have to carry some of the risks that go along with things. So, right now, there's a window of opportunity for tech leaders, for industry leaders, for the government to make policies without regard to public opinion, since the publics aren't aware. But I think that would be a mistake, because down the road, there might be public accusations that you took all these steps and we're having to pay a lot of these costs ourselves, and yet you didn't even consult with us. So two things really drove this point home for me yesterday. One was that there were protesters out front. I don't know if all of you saw them. I didn't see them, but I researched why they were out there. And it turns out they're from the South Side, where they're going to be building the IQMP, big quantum park here in Chicago, which we're all very excited about. But these particular activists and people from the community feel they're worried about the environmental degradation that might happen there. They feel that the local leaders and industry leaders have not been transparent about how they're going to go about building this. They don't know what the benefits are going to be for their communities, and they want to be part of the consultative process. So that's sort of my role in this panel, to let you know that what Americans want, especially as they become an informed electorate and informed citizens, and will start to base opinions on what happens to them as we develop these technologies, that they should be considered.
So I think, okay, so if we to think about this idea of sort of the democratic process and where public opinion should or should not be in this conversation, I think it's important to think about, we have one example, so an example that is in some sense about quantum, in that it's created by the creation of this quantum campus, which is kind of a local land use issue that's very familiar with putting up a building, with anything you do. Locally, you have these kind of issues, and we have sort of, I don't want to weigh in on whether they're good or bad procedures, but we have a long-standing set of institutions to think about how we deal with that. And then there's sort of the bigger, sort of kind of more global, what are we talking about when we talk about regulating or governing quantum? What are the problems we're trying to solve against? And I think the question of to what extent should we care about public opinion, or should public opinion be playing a major role in the discussion, I think depends on what issues we're talking about. So when we were talking about social media, we were talking a lot about things that are about the public life of a country. We were talking about the information environment. We were talking about the way in which we communicate about elections. We were talking about the way in which health information is disseminated. Things that are, I think, quite central to democratic governance broadly construed, and the idea that you would make those decisions in a way that was opaque to the democratic process seems impossible to imagine. When we're talking about, if what we're talking about with quantum is primarily technical national security concerns or other things like that, then maybe this is more the domain of experts, more that we don't necessarily, I don't know. So I guess, Kate, let me turn to you and ask, when we think about the governance and regulation and policy toolkit for quantum, what are we talking about? Is the main thing we're talking about here cryptography? Is there a whole set of other issues we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think so. It is one of the challenges that we're faced with here is that there is a lot of excitement about this technology, and there is also a lot of hype about it, and there's a lot of conflation between quantum computing and AI. And they're not the same thing. I say this as the member of a team called Quantum AI, right? So
you're to blame.
Yeah, it's a different story. And we're working on quantum computing, to be clear. We're not. So anyway, but I think the central policy issues at this point, I think, are for quantum computing are removed from the public life of a country. And there's also this added element of it. It is a hard technology to understand. And I think with AI, probably, it's a bit easier, I would say, but also I don't think people became truly aware of it until it became a real commercial product that they were using every day. So the idea that we would be able to inform everybody in the public, that seems like a challenge. In terms of the sort of policy issues, one thing that we have been trying to do, and I think that is really important, is to inform more policymakers about what is true, what is not, cut through the hype. There are these national security concerns are real. Actions like we had export controls on quantum computing at the end of last year. That's really important. A lot of conversations with policymakers around what our security practices are in the private sector, how we can strengthen those, like education. In the US, agencies like the FBI have people focused on educating the private sector on what to look out for when it comes to nation state threats, that kind of thing. Of course, there is we mentioned briefly this issue of breaking cryptography. There are real actions to be taken there right now in migration to post-quantum cryptography. That's not a policy action that's directly affecting the development of this technology, but of course, closely related to our progress. And then I would say a lot of the current policy conversation is also just around investment and to this point of geopolitical competition. There's the control side and there's the investment side. As we get further along and we have more use cases, then some of these discussions around governance of the use of the technology, I think, will become more important. Not to say that we shouldn't be starting to think about what that might look like, but I think it's pretty hard to put anything specific in place since we don't know what it looks like yet.
I just pushed back a little bit on yes, I understand you won't be able to educate every single American or people around the globe about this technology and the benefits and as well as the risks. But you do want to hire a workforce, and you're going to need to scale up a workforce, and you're going to have to kind of start from K through 12 STEM students and graduate school. And so you need to get people excited in school for these technologies. And to do that, you also need to overcome some of these perceived challenges. And I also agree, Kate, that there's a lot of conflation, not just between AI and quantum and the risks that might be involved, but also even social media. So, for example, from our survey, when we asked people what are they most concerned about, the risks that they mention are 62% say the spread of AI-generated misinformation poses a critical threat to the United States. 58% say the same about erosion of personal data security. 51% say the decryption of critical data infrastructures by bad actors. 45% job loss. That's, as we heard earlier today and yesterday, that's a real concern.
These are the answers people give to what they're concerned about with respect to quantum?
And AI. So
quantum and AI
together.
I see.
But the fact that they are also worried about misinformation, and that even goes back to social media too. So again,
there's an AI social media complementarity on misinformation.
Yeah, and
we
put them together in the questions because so few people knew about quantum. So we wanted to be able to have data that wasn't just of 15 people. So that's why we put them together. And I don't think Americans yet, average Americans, really differentiate between AI and quantum. I don't think they understand enough about it yet.
Is your sense that they don't differentiate in the sense that they're both magic words that mean tech, and they have similar views on regulation and the like of all of them? Or they're not thinking about quantum at all? They are thinking about AI and they are thinking about social media, but they're not thinking about quantum at all?
I don't think they understand what quantum is, so that's not necessarily factoring in to their judgments yet. But in terms of technology in general and how it's been introduced and the risks it's posed, as well as the opportunities it's posed, but the risks, especially data breaches and everyday things that people have experienced because of the technology that's been introduced so far. And there was a senior military official here yesterday who spoke to a bunch of us, and he made the analogy of, they didn't have traffic lights or speed limits before there were cars on the road, and that's how social media and AI have both been introduced, right? Just let's let's introduce it. Then there's all these problems that arise, and the public becomes quite concerned. That's where a lot of this hype comes in about any new technology. And so, yeah, the more we can get ahead of it in terms of policies, I think that would help assuage people's anxieties. And just one more point, that as a result of feeling these threats, and again, it could be about AI, it could be about any technology, 44% of Americans say that there's been too little regulation of AI and quantum. 11% say about right, 7% say too much, and 37% don't know enough to say. But it is interesting that if the federal government is unwilling to kind of make regulations for consumer safety, then maybe it will just fall to state and local governments.
So let's think comparatively about these. I mean, I think the social media governance conversation unfolded largely at a time when, such as they were, the disasters were also ongoing. So we were arguing about what to do about social media at the same time that we were arguing about the effects of social media on our elections and experiencing them, or the effects of social media on financial information or health information or whatever. And so we were trying to have a societal conversation about regulation and governance at the same time that we were experiencing what many at least perceived as negative effects. In the case of AI, I would say we moved the regulation conversation up a bit. We're talking about governance and regulation of AI at a time when it's exploding as an economic phenomenon, but we are not at the moment experiencing existential risk. We are not at the moment experiencing massive AI-driven job loss. We are kind of talking about the governance of the technology at the same time that we're kind of learning about the technology, but not yet. We can talk about environmental impact maybe, but I think first order, not yet experiencing serious major negative impacts of the technology. We are having a conversation about quantum, I think because of those past two conversations, at a time when we're still in the point where everybody's saying it'll be in 5 years, there'll be an app that we can build on top of this thing. And maybe it is 5 years and maybe it's 30 years, I don't know. But we're way ahead of the curve here relative to those past two technologies. Does that make the governance conversation more productive, or does it mean it's impossible to get anywhere because, one, we actually don't quite know what we need to be working on, and two, we can't get politicians motivated or maybe even industry motivated because there's no public pressure?
Yeah, I think it's great to have this top of people's mind, right? There are things that we can do, on the tech side as we do start to develop these applications to say, hey, like, how should we think about access to this application? How should we direct our resources, even try to focus on developing more applications that we may view as more societally beneficial, right? And so, things like we sponsored an X Prize with that aim earlier this year it was announced. So, I think though, in terms of action, it's difficult. It's difficult to do much beyond this sort of these technology control pieces that I've mentioned, right? Because until you have the technology being deployed, it's quite hard to put in place the regulations on the application of it.
Is there a sort of institutional infrastructure being built within, say, industry? Are there industry working groups that are creating the possibility of collaboration on governance as things ramp up?
There are discussions around this happening in, I would say, third-party forums, and then also within, certainly within Google, I am talking to the people who do our AI governance to understand how we might apply some of those procedures, how that Google has these AI principles that, we announced in, I think, 2017 or something. And so how do those apply to, in theory, they apply to all advanced technology, or in practice even, they apply to all advanced technologies that we develop. And so how do we think about applying those to quantum computing? Of course, nothing like these technology principles is ever cut and dried, right? They're in tension with each other. Thinking about how you apply them in a particular use case is not straightforward. But yes, for sure, we can think about how to set up that infrastructure. And then, yeah, but I think, in terms of like concrete regulatory actions, there's not really anything to regulate. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, Ethan, because you work in a university setting on these issues. Have there been a consortium of different experts getting together to discuss the same types of things?
Yeah, so certainly, universities spend a lot of time talking about social media, and now are spending a lot of time talking about AI. I think the quantum conversation, consistent with this, is sort of behind that, and it still feels like an engineering problem and a physics problem more than a governance problem inside the academy too. Okay, so we just saw a big announcement on AI policy yesterday, and from the American government. Maybe calling it policy is too strong, but maybe intentions or something like that. And I read the spirit of that statement as being something like, we've had a couple years of conversations about AI governance and alignment and safety, and Sam Altman talking to senators and scaring them, and we all wrung our hands for a little while and talked about maybe we should do some things, maybe there should be a pause, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had what I think of as a policy announcement was consistent maybe with things J.D. Vance has been saying for a little longer, along the lines of, look, this is a very important technology for national security and for economic growth, and it is, for all intents and purposes, an arms race among competing nation states and an arms race among competing firms, and we got to get out of the way because we got to win the race. The stakes are too high to lose the race to our geopolitical adversaries. Is your read of where quantum is headed is that if it works at scale in the way that those investing in it believe it will, that's where we're going to land as well? Or is there hope for governance in quantum?
Well, maybe
Or am I too pessimistic about AI regulation?
I'll stay out of the AI discussion, but I guess, for sure there is the tenor of the policy conversation in the US right now is also very much focused on national security and competitiveness for quantum, right? That is a fact. I think what that means for governance as we get to the point where the technology is actually deployed probably depends somewhat on how this competition goes. It depends on, the who is in power politically at that point. A lot of external factors that it's hard to speculate on. If we just, if it were today and somebody had a large-scale quantum computer, then I don't see any reason to expect it would be a different conversation than we're having on AI, but I think there are a lot of uncertainties still about where we'll go on quantum.
And I think like from, again, the public opinion perspective, I think Americans would support and understand the national security angle if it's explained to them. But it doesn't mean you should ignore the fact that, because of decryption, their banking information might be jeopardized, or there's still steps that need to be taken to safeguard public interest.
And like this, this post-quantum cryptography piece, of course, like we haven't talked much about it in this panel, but obviously there is a solution to this, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very clear solution, and so I think this is where like the awareness,
right, exactly.
If people know, then they can do something about it, and you actually can address the risk in a much more straightforward way than many of these other risks that we're talking about here. So,
and even an individual person, if they're aware this might happen, then you can tell them what kind of steps you can take.
Or like make choices, about which products you are using. Make sure that they have migrated to post-quantum cryptography. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you had this finding that I found striking and maybe slightly reassuring, but I suspect you'll disabuse me of that. So you found, and I think this is the only survey question I've seen in 5 years, where Americans said that the people they trust most to think about regulation in this space are academics and technical experts.
Yes.
That is not the mood that Americans are in general, with respect to academics and technical experts. So
I think
have they just not had time to learn that academics don't know what they're talking about, or what's going on?
I think Americans might make a distinction between, again, now I'm speculating, we didn't dig down the data, but first let me tell you what the data showed, which was that when we ask who should be most responsible for regulating advanced technology, a third don't know. But of the rest, 26% say a consortium of researchers and academics who work on these technologies. 21% say the federal government, 6% say state and local governments, and only 7% say tech companies. So I think that's the difference. So I think they think that researchers and academics, and I understand where you're coming from with your comment, but I think in this case, they think those people understand the risks as well as the positives, where the tech companies will really just push the positives because they have profits in mind, to be just blunt about it. So I think that's why this expertise is valued in this case, because we pit it against these other groups. I thought it was really interesting that they put it ahead of the government too.
Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment of why the public shouldn't trust tech companies?
Again, I think they're mostly thinking of social media here, because there was an industry survey that ranked, we talked about this in the green room, but it ranked a series of tech companies, and like the titans like Google and Amazon and Apple, they're all viewed pretty positively. In the 2/3 of Americans thought they were trustworthy. But Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, only about 1/3 trusted them. So I think we can differentiate between the tech companies and that perception.
Well, thank you for that preamble. I think, yeah, I mean, all I will say is I think I can speak for the quantum computing team at Google. They're genuinely people are very excited about potential applications, really trying to channel resources into finding these positive applications, think about how to govern the technology, make sure it's secure, all of these things. And I think that is broadly true across Google as well. Of course, companies have different interests than the government, right? So that has always been the case, that always will be the case. But it is, for something like quantum computing, our interests are, we are a research group, right? And so I think our interests are, at this point, probably more aligned with academia, government. We want to develop this technology and as fast as possible make it useful. So
maybe for both of you to wrap us up, if there was something over the next couple years that you could wave a wand and the public sector would do in this space that would be productive, what would it be?
So, I'll just go back to, I think if I can be cheeky and pick two things. I mean, the first is push more on this, get everybody to migrate to post-quantum cryptography, right? There's a very clear risk here. We know what it is, and there's been a lot of progress on government migration, but I think more could be done to get the private sector to move there. And then the second piece is just, it is going back, we have made a lot of tangible progress. We're getting closer to large-scale quantum computers, but we still need a lot of R&D investment. We need a lot of investment in workforce development at all levels. I agree, at K-12, but also for sure, university. So just,
And adults too, who might lose their
jobs. So investment is the biggest thing at this point.
Yeah, and hopefully it wouldn't just be government investment, which seems pretty tenuous now, but also private sector investment. I would say, I don't know if he's in the audience today, but yesterday there was a panel, and Sebastian from Denmark, the quantum ambassador. I think I'd love to clone him and send him all around the world, especially this country. He was really great at elucidating in a way that everyday people can understand the organizations trying to develop quantum would like to maximize the benefits for everybody and distribute the costs to everybody too. And I think people like that can, because yes, we're not going to bring every single American on board, but you want a cadre of well-informed, optimistic people to help drive this forward. And also conferences like this, and even mini conferences like this, where you can bring in just people who are even curious and get them to learn more so they can spread the word to their communities as well. And then just the job loss thing is something that for AI, probably more immediate than quantum, but I don't feel like we have policies in place that are going to address that. And that is something that Arvind, the CEO from IBM, also talked about, how they're trying to do that internally. So whatever attention on that issue, I think, would be important, as well as the talent development.
Great, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation.